To pick a moment when the gig economy first arrived in the UK isn't really possible. The gig economy isn't one app, nor one sector, but made up of a myriad of different companies which arrived on the UK shores in dribs and drabs. But there's one moment that always stands out to me as the point where the gig economy entered into our collective consciousness. It was 2014 and Uber is starting to make its name in London, and the traditional black cab industry were up in arms. They took to the streets and blockaded central London, bringing traffic to a standstill and gaining national media coverage.
You probably know that there is a considerable dispute going on among traditional black cab drivers at the launch of a new app which they say is threatening their livelihood. Now, there's been something of a...
But far from damaging the company, the protest led to an 850% increase in downloads of the Uber app as the media finally turned its attention to this new company promising to reinvent the taxi market. This moment feels symbolic. The moment that signalled the transformation of the gig economy from fringe to mainstream, as an age-old industry gave its final effort to protect itself from the onslaught of the new. The moment that gig economy platforms took hold as an integral part of many people's lives in the UK. It was another year before the number of Uber drivers surpassed that of black cab drivers, and as of this year, there are more than twice as many Uber drivers as black cab drivers in the capital. Last month, Fairwork released our first ever round of scoring for the UK. We gave 11 platforms a fairness score out of 10, based on their ability to provide fair and decent work. Scores range from 8 all the way down to 0, showing a massive variation in the types of work being provided by different platforms. But the conditions present within the gig economy do not arise in a vacuum, but emerge out of specific social, cultural, economic and political contexts. I'm Robbie Waring, and to mark the release of the first round of UK scores, this week on the Fairwork podcast, we are joined by Alessio Bertolini, a postdoctoral researcher at Fairwork. Alessio is here to help us understand the gig economy in the UK. Where did it come from? What decisions led us to this point? And what does the future hold? We begin by exploring the deceptively complicated question of what actually is the gig economy.
So the gig economy is indeed a very complicated phenomenon, which in many respects, and to some extent, is a very new form of work, which is based on and mediated by digital platforms. But at the same time, it also resembles other forms of work that have existed actually for centuries. So many people say that it resembles very much the type of work that existed before industrial capitalism, also in the first stages of the Industrial Revolution, where a lot of the jobs that were offered were very precarious, were on demand, were paid piece rate, without a clear career, without a clear time pattern, and without a workplace even, with many people working from home. So in a sense, it resembles these very old forms of work that have been sort of eliminated or have decreased during the past decades or in the past century. But at the same time, it's very similar to other forms of non-standard employment, which have spread in the past 2 or 3 decades in the UK, but also in many other developed countries and developing countries, like zero-hour contract, like jobs on call, like temporary agency work. And many other forms of work which definitely don't resemble still what people have in mind, the kind of standardized full-time 9-to-5 job for life, which hasn't in a sense been the standard for quite a long time in the UK and in many other countries.
So in a sense, the gig economy is something new, but it's also something very old, rooted in a history of the deregulation of employment rights and neoliberal governance. But what really marks the gig economy out is that the work itself is mediated by digital platforms.
So platforms do act nowadays as employers, and of course, the term employers and employees are actually quite controversial in many ways, and we'll discuss maybe this a little bit later. basically a lot of the functions that more traditional employers have, like management controls, hiring and firing, control over the workload, are now performed directly by the platform, partly in automated ways through algorithms and other digital devices, but also partly through people, but always through the intermediation of the app or the platform. And this is the real difference. Of course, with this main change, there are also some related issues and some related characteristics of platform work, which makes it very different from other forms of work, such as the fact that management is mostly done automatically by algorithms, the fact that many of the decisions, a lot of the management choices are also automated and done through algorithms. And of course, this has related issues with, for example, data protection, data control, and data management, because these platforms, apart from giving jobs, they also harvest large amounts of data from workers in often not very transparent way. So this is, in a sense, these are characteristics that make platform work very different from more traditional forms of work and makes platforms quite different from more traditional employers.
So, if we understand that a key aspect of the gig economy is that work is platform mediated, then of course we have to ask, what are platforms?
So the term platform itself is also quite controversial. So generally, platforms are defined as a digital marketplace that allow to the digital meeting of demand and supply. But platforms, at least some of these platforms, actually do much more than simply matching demand and supply. Platforms are apps or technological devices that you generally use through computers or through smartphones, and they provide a lot of the functions that generally a normal workplace, and as I was saying earlier, also more traditional employers do. So workers can find work through the app form, through text messages, through simple messaging on the app. They know where to go. They use the GPS to be allocated a specific direction or a specific path they need to follow. Thanks to the app, they know where to meet the client. They know how long we'll have to take to perform a certain functions. They know the price and the pay they're going to receive for a certain service. And as I was saying earlier, also a lot of the management function and control function are also operated through this device.
So platforms organise work. They act as a space in which different actors meet, the digital infrastructure for which management and control are enacted. But there are a huge number of different types of labour platform. At Fairwork, we generally categorise platforms into two different categories: cloud work platforms and geographically tethered platforms.
The main distinction is between where the work is done and how the work is conducted. So cloud work platforms are labor platforms in which the actual work can be conducted interiorly from anywhere in the world as long as you have an internet connection. And once the companies that run the platform are based in a specific countries, the workforce on the platform can be actually global or planetary, because you just need to log in into a website or an app and you can perform the work from wherever you are.
And then there are the other kinds of platforms, which at Fairwork we refer to as geographically tethered or location-based platforms. These are the platforms that we tend to be much more familiar with, including the likes of ride-hailing platforms like Uber, Bolt or Ola, or food delivery platforms like Deliveroo, Uber Eats or Just Eat. And these platforms instead require us to have a much more localised workforce, because although the company associated with the platform can be located anywhere, the actual worker must be present in a specific geographic location for the work to be completed.
Of course, there's two types of platforms that are very different the way work is performed, also in the types of issues and problems that are associated with these forms of work.
Gig work exists around the globe, in countries across the global north and south, operating in numerous different social, political, economic and cultural contexts. And for Alessio, understanding this context is very important.
None of these phenomena are actually happening in a social and institutional vacuum. We will always have the idea that, in a sense, the platform, because it's a new phenomenon and technology, will override all other aspects of society. In a sense, we have this sort of implicit bias towards this kind of technological determinism.
However, in reality, other social, economic and institutional factors, and even political factors, play an important role in the way the platform economy operates in different countries.
And the UK, even before the advent of the platform economy, has been a very liberalised labour market with a very deregulated employment framework, at least since the Thatcher era. And platform work is not the first kind of non-standard, precarious and insecure work that has happened and has appeared in the UK. From the time in which fixed-term contracts were introduced and legalised back in the 70s, to the kind of more recent spread of agency work and zero-hour contract that appears specifically in the past 10 to 15 years after the financial crisis, or immediately before the financial crisis, we can see how, the platform economy is part of a much broader trend towards the deregulation of the labour market, towards more insecure and more regular employment, and further away from the classical 9-to-5 regular full-time permanent job. And since the early Thatcher era,
well, I think the unions are obviously one body where a tiny fanatical minority can and seem to be able to take over a whole union.
Going up to the recent Trade Unions Act of 2016.
It saddens me beyond words that we're here today dealing with the most significant, sustained and partisan attack on 6 million trade union members and their workplace organisations that we've seen in this country in the last 30 years.
Unions have always been kind of disempowered in representing workers, not only, of course, in the platform economy, in the non-standard employment, but more generally in the UK labour market. So the context of the gig economy in the UK is a very liberalised one, is a very deregulated one, is one in which unions have had very little power to represent workers. And none of the recent governments have been actually willing to introduce any form of re-regulation or any form of minimum labour standards in this form of work, nor for the other forms of precarious non-standard work, which are also very common in the UK.
The voices you heard there were Margaret Thatcher talking in 1984 and the MP Angela Eagle addressing the Commons in 2015.
So the gig economy is a very recent phenomenon. It only started developing the last, not even a decade, and really is now booming. And the current coronavirus pandemic has actually accelerated the growth of this form of work. But many of us probably have an Uber app or a Deliveroo app to get deliveries on a weekend or to go on a ride when I don't know, maybe it's late at night or when it's raining. So these platforms have become very, very common, and they employ many people, several 100,000 or up to millions. According to some Office of National Statistics estimate, about 4% of the UK population in 2019 was employed in the gig economy. And these companies, these forms of work have been growing at double digits in terms of workforce, but also in terms of revenues.
In terms of the development of the gig economy in the UK, there are several key moments which help us to understand the way in which the gig economy is structured and the way in which it is regulated. One such moment, which shaped the political landscape surrounding the UK government's attempt to regulate the platform economy, was the publication of the Taylor Review.
The Theresa May government, prompted by some scandals of labour market exploitations in the low-skilled service sectors, which were not actually confined to just the platform's economy, but this prompted the government to actually rethink the labour market framework and how it was penalising many workers, and it was posing many issues when it comes to quality of work and exploitation in the labour market.
Theresa May decided to commission an independent review by Matthew Taylor from the RSA in order to rethink what possible reforms could be done within the UK labour market and what could be put in place to make it more adapted to new working practices.
As the world of work changes, our practices and laws must properly reflect and accommodate those changes, because good work is in the interests of good business.
Again, as I said, it was not confined to the platform economy, but the platform economy was definitely on top of the agenda, together with other forms of these non-standard or very precarious work like zero-hour contract. Matthew Taylor wrote an independent review together with many collaborators that was published in 2017 and became known as the so-called Taylor Review. And although the Taylor Review, in a sense, addressed and discussed many of the issues in relation to the platform economy, it didn't really introduce any major reform or any major suggestion for reform in the UK labour market framework. It discussed, for example, the issue of employment status, and it pledges is kind of suggested to have a better and clearer classification of the definition of worker. But it doesn't really address the issue of algorithmic management and data protection.
But the report failed to go far enough in meaningfully introducing any major change to the current government regulation, most notably in terms of the employment classification of gig workers.
The Theresa May government was actually even more timid in that sense. It really followed only a handful of the suggestions that were proposed by Taylor in the review. And the result of it is actually that now, up to almost like 5 years, 4.5 years after the review was published, we really have an employment regulation framework that hasn't really changed much compared to what it was a decade or even 15 years ago. So it really cannot be said to have really adapted to these new conditions and to these new working practices. And at the same time, the recent government by Boris Johnson have been, of course, very busy with the Brexit issues first, and now with the coronavirus pandemic. So the issue of employment regulation and employment reforms have been going down on the priority agenda for this government. And of course, there's been a lot of discussion about the introduction now by Rishi Sunak of a new employment bill. This hasn't really appeared it kind of hasn't been published or hasn't really been discussed, let aside being approved.
However, 2021 saw a landmark ruling in the UK Supreme Court on the case Uber versus Aslam, brought to a tribunal by Uber drivers contesting their employment status.
The Supreme Court has ruled that a group of Uber drivers must be treated as workers rather than self-employed, a decision which means they could be entitled to a minimum wage and holiday pay.
And this represented a landmark ruling in the platform economy, declaring Uber drivers to be limby workers rather than self-employed, and this granted them a number of employment rights, including minimum wage, holiday pay, social protections, and so on. But also, for example, right to health and safety, anti-discrimination law, and of course a bigger ability to actually collectively bargain and to collectively be represented by unions and workers' organizations. And the GMB was one of the unions that only a few days ago signed the first collective agreement between Uber and a union for the regulations of these forms of work. And as I said, this Supreme Court case came after almost 5 years of a battle that this group of Uber drivers had brought against Uber in order to be reclassified. And but the Uber case, in a sense, has not been the only case that's been brought to court contesting the employment status of these workers. There have been many other court cases that have been brought in front of the court by unions, in front of the employment tribunals, to regulate and change the current status of many drivers. But not only in relation to the employment status, but also with issues such as algorithmic management, algorithmic control, and data protection. There was also a recent ruling of a court in Amsterdam, because part of the contract between Uber and its drivers is regulated by Dutch law. So this case was brought to an Amsterdam tribunal by a handful of Uber drivers from the UK. And they were asking for more transparency in algorithmic management and more clarity about data management. And again, the court ruled in favor of the drivers, saying that Uber and other gig companies, such as Ola, also have to provide more transparency in the ways jobs are allocated and in the way data are managed and stored and used by companies. So as you can see, there have been a lot of movement at the level of courts, at the level of jurisprudence. However, it's also important to highlight that many political parties are becoming more aware that this work cannot be done just by the court, and there is really a specific need to change legislations to make the courts work less and also to make it easier for workers to see their rights enforced. So in the end, these working practices implemented by the platforms will be probably subject to change in the courts, but we really need to make the change happening at the more political and legislative level rather than being decided by the court. So it's important not to leave this all to the courts, but having an employment framework that really works for everyone, that is simple, that is clear, and it grants a minimum of labor standards for every worker, not just in the platform economy, but in any sector and in any forms of work in the UK economy.
Understanding the context of the gig economy in the UK is particularly important given the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic. This includes not only the uncertain financial implications for the UK economy, but also the increased role that gig economy platforms have played in the provision of services since the UK began implementing lockdowns in March last year.
So in a sense, with Brexit, with the economic crisis brought by the coronavirus, we haven't actually really understood the extent or how severe the overall economic consequences of the crisis will be, and what the post-pandemic world will look like. But we don't know exactly also what's going to be the consequences in employment for many workers. But what we know is that an increase in unemployment and increasing difficulties for workers to find employment in more traditional sectors, we can expect that many of these workers will switch, at least temporarily, until they find better job opportunities to platform work. In a sense, platform work grants is an easy way to earn some money, to earn an income, while at the same time looking for other forms of employment, because it grants at least a certain degree of flexibility. So in a sense, it will be even more relevant in the years to come to really find a clear way and a decent way of regulating the gig economy, because many more workers will be involved in these forms of employment. And according to some estimates, by 2025, up to 1/3 of labor transactions will be mediated by a digital platform. So we're talking, although these estimates might be slightly exaggerated, this gives you an idea of the size of the phenomenon and how much it will grow in the incoming years. At the same time, we also know that many traditional companies, in order to save costs, in order to simplify the labor process, are also switching to more optimized forms of employment, which are platformized. And of course, this is in a sense a form also of outsourcing of some working activities that before were done in-house. So we see the expansion of platform economy in two ways. On the one hand, we will have more kind of already established platforms that will expand their revenues and their activities, attracting more workers. And on the other hand, more traditional companies that will also expand in the platform economy by relying on platform-based forms of work.
We're entering into an uncertain future, where the model currently being created and perfected by gig economy platforms looks set to expand into new areas of our economy. At the same time, the UK is faced with a number of external challenges to the functioning of its economy. So what does the future look like for the gig economy in the UK?
Well, this is very difficult to say, although there are some kind of optimistic signs. As I said, the Supreme Court case is a very good victory, is a very important for many ride-hailing workers in the UK. And other cases will also bring some clarity on the working condition and especially the employment status of these gig economy workers in the UK. So the signs are encouraging, but as I was saying before, not everything can be left to the court. And from the policy side, from the government side, we haven't really seen many encouraging steps over the regulations and the clarifications of the employment status of these workers. So while there are some encouraging signs from the tribunals and the court side, there hasn't been so many encouraging signs from the government and from kind of the policymakers side. At the same time, outside the policy arena, we also see that some platforms are recognizing the sustainability of their working models. Platforms like Just Eat has made important moves towards reclassifying its workers. Uber has voluntarily decided to reclassify its workforce, although it was only obliged to do so for a certain number of workers. And as I said, by changing the employment status, this will provide workers with many more rights, and it will be a very important step towards granting these workers fairer and more decent working conditions. So we see that some action has been happening on the company side, and this might predict more changes to come in the incoming years. And I hope that the work we are doing with Fairwork will also help pushing the platform economy in the UK towards fairer standards and more fairer and decent forms of work for UK gig workers.
Thanks to Alessio Bertolini. At Fairwork, we believe that all work can and should be characterised by fair pay, fair conditions, fair contracts, fair management and fair representation. Platforms ultimately have the power to improve standards and the ability to choose to. We're actively campaigning to improve the conditions for gig workers around the world and hold platforms to account. You can find out more at fair.work. This episode was written and produced by Robbie Warren, with composition by Louis Bollez.